my interests developed over a fairly long period of time, and as a result of some accidents, some commitments, and some feeling that as a Jew and as an American and as someone interested in the UN, there was a particularly strong sense that the Palestinian people were being victimized, not being allowed to achieve their fundamental rights, above all the right of self-determination, and that the US government, the country of which I'm a citizen, was complicit, to put it mildly, in giving Israel the political space to defy international law without suffering any adverse consequences. I also was a close friend of Edward Said, who used to tease me about being so interested in Vietnam and not paying attention to what was being done to the Palestinians. And I realized he had a good point, and step by step, I became involved, and then, to my surprise, I was appointed to this role at the UN, which led me to a much deeper appreciation of the issues, as well as a sense of how strongly contested this territory had become, and how unfortunate it was that those who sought to defend Israel tried to smear critics with the allegation of their anti-Semitism, or in my case, also being a self-hating Jew. So it's been a long story of engagement, but my sense of empathy for the ordeal of the Palestinian people has not diminished, despite the friction my involvement has caused and sometimes brought pretty hostile pushback in my direction.
Okay, so I'm curious, out of the time that you served as the UN Special Rapporteur for the Occupied Palestinian Territories, what really shocked you the most about what's taking place in the occupied territories today, or what touched you the most?
Well, I think it's hard to isolate any single incident or event. Of course, the massive attacks on Gaza at the end of 2008, in the beginning of 2009, and then again in 2012 and 2014, were the most spectacular series of violations of international law. But I also was very deeply affected by the whole settler phenomenon, the settler violence against Palestinian civilians, the efforts to change the character of East Jerusalem in such a way as to make stronger the claim of ethnic entitlement that Israel was pushing as a basis for saying that Jerusalem was a unified city under permanent Israeli control and sovereignty. So it's hard to isolate an issue, but the whole picture, I think, added up to one of a structure of systematic domination, not only toward those people occupied, but also toward those living in East Jerusalem, toward those who were confined for decades to refugee camps or were somehow dispersed as involuntary exiles. So there is a kind of continuity of abuse that has been experienced by the Palestinian people and extends to the Palestinian minority living in Israel itself. So I suppose that's a rather unresponsive answer to your question, but it really does reflect my feelings about the difficulty of focusing on any one aspect of this situation.
I think that a lot of people appreciate the report that you came out with because it looked at the issue beyond the occupied Palestinian territories to see the Palestinian people as a whole and look at how they're treated within Israel's pre-1967 borders and the issue of the Palestinian refugees. So I was wondering if you can just elaborate a little bit further on this way of perceiving Israel as an apartheid state, because we so often hear of the apartheid label being used to describe Israel's regime of military occupation and segregation in the occupied Palestinian territory. But if you can elaborate a little bit, of how apartheid can be used as an effective way of seeing the situation more broadly, that would be really helpful.
I should say at the outset of trying to answer this question with reasonable brevity, that the discourse in apartheid that caused such a firestorm at the UN is something that Israeli leaders internally have been discussing one way or another ever since the establishment of Israel back in 1948. Leaders like Ben Gurion, Isaac Rabin, Olmert, others have referred to if Israel doesn't solve the Palestinian problem in one way or another, it's going to lapse into being an apartheid state. So what our study tried to do was to look at the international law definition of what constitutes apartheid as it was set forth in the 1973 International Convention on the Suppression and Punishment of the Crime of Apartheid. And we found that what is happening in Israel with respect to the Palestinians, the policies of Israel, policies and practices of Israel toward the Palestinian people as a whole, constitute a deliberate and systematic effort to create a structure that sustains domination based on ethnic identity, which in the language of the Apartheid Convention and international law is an identification premised on race. It also, in the International Criminal Court's Rome Statute, apartheid detached from its background in South Africa is treated as one form of a crime against humanity. And so what we found in these four domains that we examined, which, as you suggested, included not only those living under occupation, but also those living in East Jerusalem, those living as a minority in Israel, and those living in refugee camps and as involuntary exiles. All of those fragmented segments of the Palestinian unity as a people are being and have been for a very long time systematically victimized in ways that correspond to the international law definition of apartheid. And we feel that, and our recommendations in the report reach the conclusion that there is a responsibility not only of the UN, but of governments and of civil society to take this conclusion seriously, and if it is persuasive, to do what can be done nonviolently to promote an end to apartheid. And finally, and this is sort of outside the report, but flows from the report, especially in my own thinking, that shifting from a slogan of ending occupation to ending apartheid is the right approach to take at this stage to for fulfilling a commitment to the realization of basic Palestinian rights. Because just as South Africa sustained its identity as a sovereign state when it dismantled apartheid, so Israel, contrary to those that say anyone who alleges apartheid is trying to destroy the state of Israel, that's not the case. Our point is that as long as it practices as long as it's responsible for perpetuating this structure of apartheid, it cannot fulfill either its legitimate role as a sovereign state, and certainly it can't contribute to the realization of Palestinian rights. So it's our central view that Israel, as a legitimate state, should dismantle this structure of apartheid.
Could you speak a little bit, Richard, about the role of Special Rapporteur, just to give a bit of background to what the purpose of it is, and I guess what the future of it will be, based on the fact that yourself and the current Special Rapporteur for the Occupied Palestinian Territory has been unable to even enter the territories to do that kind of investigative work that's needed. So if you can enlighten us about that, that would be great.
Yeah, I should mention that my successor, Michael Link, is a Canadian, which may be of interest to those that are watching this webinar. And he is trying his very best to do as good a job as it's possible to do, and deserves the support of all of us that are interested in these issues. The role of Special Rapporteur is an interesting one. There are relatively few country special rapporteurs. The only other ones are connected with Myanmar, North Korea, Iran. And this one is focused on not Israel, but on Israel's role in the occupied territory. And because it's under the auspices of the Human Rights Council, it is concerned especially with the human rights dimensions of the occupation. But in order to deal with the occupation, I found it necessary to deal with these other dimensions of Israeli control, and the occupation itself has gradually transformed into a form of gradual annexation or a disengagement with physical occupation, as in Gaza, and reliance on indirect methods of control. The Office of Special Rapporteur is created by the governments, the 49 governments that constitute the Human Rights Council. It's an unpaid position, but in exchange for not being compensated, one does enjoy independence. And that's very valuable in this special rapporteurship, because one is subjected not so much by the Israeli government as by its very compliant NGOs, particularly in Geneva, the UN Watch, which really focused defamatory attention on me and my predecessor and my successor. And they take it to be their role to create this emphasis that has been of growing concern, I think, to try to wound the messenger as a way of evading the message. Israel and the and its subservient NGOs also evade the message. And I think they evade it because it really can't stand up to a serious scrutiny. And as the substantive positions of Israel have grown weaker, the reliance on discrediting critics by engaging in this defamatory rhetoric of calling people who are perfectly normal academics or private citizens, calling them anti-Semites and in some cases self-hating Jews. It's a real unfortunate aspect of this context, especially at this time where some genuine hatred of Jews has reemerged along with the surge of support for the extreme right in North America and in Europe. So it is. It has a double liability. It removes attention from the Palestinian ordeal, and it blurs the distinction between playing the anti-Semitic card and the genuine reality of anti-Semitism.
Yeah, that's a very good point. I wonder if that has something to do perhaps with the traction that Palestinian human rights kind of is able to get in Europe compared to in North America. I don't know if, could you speak to maybe the issue of the Palestinian human rights issue being something that European governments seem to be more inclined to take up than the Canadian and the American government? What do you think the realities are behind that situation?
Well, I think that's an important point. I think that the Europeans still have a certain sense of justifiable guilt about what happened in the 1930s, and that there is that memory particularly strong in Germany and rather strong in France, and not even as weak as one would expect in Britain, a sense that that there was various levels of complicity with the genocidal policies of Nazi Germany and the widespread anti-Semitism that was existed in Europe during the 30s, aside from Hitler. People don't realize that Hitler wasn't, and the Nazi Party was not the only source of anti-Semitism in Europe, and we see it reemerging to some degree, to a disturbing degree, in Eastern Europe. But the anti-Semitism in Poland and in Hungary and in France were also very serious dimensions of the political scene. And I think World War II did leave that residue of guilt combined with the deep sense that European societies must never again allow these kinds of racist sentiments to reemerge and assume prominence in society. Unfortunately, they have been reemerging as part of this right-wing resurgence that I referred to. But there is this sensitivity. And of course, one of the confusing issues is that all along, and this is included in the 1930s, anti-Semitism could coexist with certain forms of Zionism, because there was this sense that one way to solve the so-called Jewish problem was to get Jews to leave Europe and go to Palestine. And so, for instance, in Poland during the 1930s, the Polish government helped train the Zionist militias that later were so significant in the War of Independence in 1947-48. And they did this not because they were empathetic with Jews or with the Zionist vision of a Jewish homeland, but because they really wanted Jews to leave Poland. And that whole story is not really understood. And it's part of the, I think part of the ideological strategy of Israel is not to allow that story to be understood, because they want to speak, as you said in your introduction, they want Jews everywhere to think that Israel and Zionism are the voice of every Jew, wherever he exists. And if you don't accept that voice, then you are almost by definition an anti-Semite. See, and that kind of confusion exists where, I mean, you have it on both sides, as I say. On the one side, you have anti-Semites who want to promote the cause of Israel as a way of getting rid of Jews in their own country. And it's true for so-called Christian Zionists in the US. And then you have Israelis who want to discredit those who don't accept this unity of Zionism and Israel and Judaism.
Richard, I don't know if this is something that you've talked about much in your writings, but I was wondering if you can shed a little bit more light on the issue of the kind of mainstream Jewish community's acceptance of Zionism as something hegemonic. If you can speak at all to that, or perhaps just your personal experiences of dealing with that as someone who's Jewish, and how that impacts on your own identity.
Well, I don't have too much experience with that, except to have noted two things. In my childhood, which was in Manhattan, in New York City, there was a definite split within the Jewish community between those that profess support for Zionism and those that either were indifferent to it or actually opposed to it and felt that it was a way of discrediting and diminishing the diaspora and diaspora Jews. And I think that split lasted through the Holocaust, despite the Holocaust. But what changed the Jewish community more than anything else, I feel, was the post-1967 triumphalism in which Israel demonstrated not only that it was a Jewish homeland, but that it was a powerhouse in regional and even in international relations. And that seemed to create a sense of pride on the part of Jews that had formerly not been very identified with Israel or with what Israel represented. And now I think one's in a cycle where, again, there's more of the pre-67 division in the American Jewish communities, and Zionism and unconditional support for Israel are not nearly as prevalent as they were 5 to 10 years ago, and especially not on university campuses and among younger people.
Yeah, I would agree with that for sure. That's a very good point. I was wondering if you could just speak a bit more about kind of the issue you were saying earlier about how Israel has to end apartheid. A lot of people are always asking questions about like what's the proper resolution to the situation in Israel-Palestine. So I mean, what would that look like if apartheid were to end? Because you were speaking as well about Israel's existence as a state. So I mean, how do you kind of reconcile the end of apartheid with Israel's existence as a state?
Well, I think the most provocative and controversial aspect of this insistence is that Israel could no longer claim to be an exclusively Jewish state. It would have to it would have to return to the promise of the Balfour Declaration, which is to create a Jewish homeland, which doesn't entail the existence of a distinct sovereign state. It would also mean an end to the occupation. It would also create a new climate for constructive diplomacy, which could go in whatever direction the representatives of the Jewish people and the Palestinian people could agree upon, hopefully without the kind of geopolitical management of the process that the United States produced during the Oslo period of diplomacy, which I think was a sure recipe for failure to distort a diplomatic negotiation by having the intermediary, the strongest partisan of the stronger party in the negotiation, created a situation that was, I think, totally unacceptable from the point of view of trying to reach a fair and sustainable and just solution. So I would hope that ending apartheid would be accompanied by this sense that Israel is better off and its real spirit preserved by a process that respects Palestinian and non-Jewish rights in historic Palestine. And whatever arrangement is acceptable to the parties, genuinely and legitimately represented, seems to me to be an acceptable outcome. The Palestinians have suffered too long from the international community trying to decide what should be done in historic Palestine, going back, of course, to this 100th anniversary of the Balfour Declaration, where without ever consulting the people who were living in the territory, this pledge was made to the World Zionist Movement. And then the partition arrangement that the UN agreed to in 1947 and had been recommended by the British, who always end their colonial experience by dividing up the country where they've dominated previously through a divide and rule strategy. Both of these undertakings were in direct conflict with this emerging fundamental human rights norm that every people has a right of self-determination. And that failure of the UN, once it was assumed the responsibility after the British left Palestine, explains partly why the UN has been so preoccupied with the future of the territory. It's one of the reasons that the US Congress is always complaining, is that they allege that the UN is obsessed with Israel and its violations of international law. But it's obsessed because the UN has failed in the one context of decolonization that it was given responsibility for solving. No other place in the world had that kind of relationship to the UN that Palestine had as a result of the way in which the British ended their mandate.
So just coming back to your report for a minute here, Richard, the fact that the report was released and then removed basically immediately from the UN website that it was on, I'm wondering what the long-term impacts of that decision will be. Do you have any comment on that?
Well, I think it does show the linkage between geopolitics and UN policy. It's inconceivable to me that this would have been done had the US not made the kind of furious, immediate reaction without ever seeing the report that Ambassador Nikki Haley made and insisted that the UN do something. The UN is confronted already with the Trump administration's threat of withholding significant amounts of funding. And the Secretary General, new Secretary General, Antonio Guterres, undoubtedly felt severe pressure. During my own period as Special Rapporteur, I was attacked a couple times by Ban Ki-moon, the predecessor, who, when questioned privately about this, said, you know, I have to demonstrate to Washington that I'm sufficiently pro-Israeli. And one of the easy ways of doing that was to attack the Special Rapporteur, which he knew he could attack without having to dismiss, because he didn't have the power to dismiss me. He only had the power to attack me. Here in this case, Guterres, if you read the fine print, said he wasn't making a decision based on the substance of the report. It was the process by which it was originally put on the website, which didn't involve proper consultation with the headquarters. But it was taken by the sponsoring commission and its director, Rima Khalaf, as a repudiation of a report that they had taken responsibility for. And so she resigned on principle, which is itself an unusual happening in UN civil service circles. So it did cause a significant stir, which had the indirect benefit for us of having the report read 10 times as much as it would otherwise have been if it had been treated just as one more routine UN report, of which there are hundreds every year, 99% of which don't get very significant attention.
So based on Guterres's explanation as to why it was taken off the website, is there any potential that it would be made available again officially through some sort of UN channel?
We don't really know at this stage. What did happen was that the foreign ministers of the 18 members of this ESCWA, the Economic and Social Commission for West Asia, they unanimously accepted the report and recommended that it be treated as authoritative throughout the UN system. Now, how that plays out in the Human Rights Council and in the General Assembly and the Security Council is hard to say. But what we do know is it's been very widely read and has, I think, exerted much more influence than we could have anticipated at this stage. What the future holds depends, I think, largely on the political climate as it evolves.
So, Richard, I wanted to ask you a question about your most recent book. So your most recent book is entitled Palestine's Horizon Toward a Just Peace. And you argue that from its inception, the two-state solution was never really a viable option for a just solution. So you spoke about the situation of apartheid and how it kind of is something that you have to look at holistically in terms of the whole treatment of the Palestinian people. I was wondering if there can still be an end to apartheid and there be some sort of two-state solution within that framework.
Well, that's a really good question, Tyler, and an important one, I think. The basis of my view was the sense that in the 21st century, you can't reconcile human rights, the observance of human rights, with the claim of exclusive ethnic or religious identity for a governing process. And in that sense, the commitment to human rights implies a commitment to the neutrality of the state with respect to diversities within its own boundaries. So in my view, Israel is trying to become an ethnocracy rather than a democracy. And it resembles to some degree the Islamic Republic of Iran, which claims to be a religious, theocratic state. In one way, Iran is less violative of international human rights because it doesn't discriminate, as far as I know, between Muslims and others with respect to their internal rights within Iran. And it has no right of return, for instance, for Shiite Muslims that would correspond to the right of return that Israel has granted to Jews, whatever their lack of connection to Israel is concerned, and denial of such a right to any Palestinian, however persuasive their link to Palestine or to pre-Israeli Palestine might be. So I think on that level, it's as long as the claim is made that Israel is a exclusively Jewish state, I don't think a two-state solution is a just and sustainable one. On the other hand, if the two peoples legitimately represented want to agree on some kind of duality of that sort, then I think the rest of the world should and can respect it, even if it does depart from what I'm saying is the legitimate foundation of sovereignty in the 21st century being a secular identity. The world accepts states like Iran, despite its departure from secularism, and Saudi Arabia is equally guilty of being in its own way a combination of dynastic and theocratic state. So there are exceptions. It just seems to me that those exceptions are difficult to reconcile with the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. But that's a personal opinion. And my whole approach is to say that what these two peoples agree upon in a setting that is respectful of their equality is something that I think the rest of the world should live with.
Thank you, Richard. So it's 7:50 Eastern, 4:50 Pacific. So I think at this point, I'm going to start drawing some questions from the questions that people have been sending in through the Q&A. I encourage you to continue sending in questions, but as I said, we're at this point close to 100 viewers, so we're not going to be able to get to everyone's question. But yes, so thank you for participating. So I'm just going to start drawing some questions here, just a moment. So Richard, are there any institutional mechanisms to help bring about the right of return of Palestinian refugees?
Well, I think there is, of course, the UN system itself is a potential mechanism. It can create a commission dedicated to this goal. It has, of course, in General Assembly Resolution 194, affirmed the right of return of Palestinian refugees. And one of the reasons that we felt it was important to emphasize the Palestinian people rather than the occupation in our apartheid report is that this conflict is not just about territory. It's more fundamentally about people. And the focus on territory is a way of marginalizing the grievances of those that are not living under occupation, but are still being victimized by the structure of Israeli domination. So I think that what I would say is that the existence of mechanisms or their absence is a reflection of political will. And if the political will exists and the geopolitical climate permits, then effective mechanisms could be created. But so long as that political will doesn't exist, it's fanciful to suppose that there can be effective mechanisms outside perhaps of civil society initiatives. For instance, a tribunal, a civil society tribunal on the Palestinian right of return would, I think, be a rather important creative initiative if it was responsibly organized and had people of moral stature participating. And I think you can affect the climate. I've been arguing for some years that what the best hope for a sustainable and just solution is derives from what I call a legitimacy war. That is the Palestinian influence on public opinion internationally, that they have a rightful position under international law and incompatibility with international morality. If you look at how the conflicts of the last 75 years have been resolved, they have not been a reflection of the military balance of power. The stronger side lost all the colonial wars, and the side that won the legitimacy war won control over the political outcome. That's something that's often forgotten by those of us that are socialized into so-called political realism, where we think the side with the greatest military capability is the side that controls the political outcome. We in the US should have learned this lesson in the Vietnam War, where the US was completely controlling of the battlefield from land, sea, and air, and yet lost the war. That's a metaphor for conflict resolution in the late 20th and early 21st century that we forget at our peril.
Great, thanks, Richard. There's another question here. I'm going to keep the questions like from an anonymous source, just in case some people don't feel comfortable with having their name mentioned. So, Richard, can you comment on Israel's dangerous nuclear weapon situation and the boycott of the United Nations talks on the abolition of nuclear weapons?
Well, Israel's attitude toward nuclear weapons is, in that sense, not different from the attitude of other nuclear weapon states. It's one of 9 nuclear weapon states. I think it's short-sighted in not recognizing that if it agreed to abolish its nuclear weapons arsenal, it could have a very supportive regional security arrangement that the other countries, the Arab countries and Iran and Turkey, would be delighted to join in on. And it would establish a nuclear weapons-free zone in the region that would contribute to its stability. Israel has such a military edge in conventional weaponry that it is really a gratuitous and destabilizing part of the regional turmoil that it alone possesses nuclear weapons and refuses to consider any kind of diplomacy, however verified accompanied by other security arrangements, the process of denuclearization might become. So I think it's an important issue. Those of us that have been interested in promoting stability and peace in the Middle East generally have long advocated a nuclear-free zone in the Middle East that all the governments, aside from Israel, are in support of. So it is one of the ways in which Israel defies the regional consensus as to what would bring peace and security.
Great, thank you. So we're all used to the common refrain from supporters of Israel that Israel is being singled out for criticism. So one of the questioners is wondering what the best response is from your perspective to that talking point.
Well, I think I tried to indicate part of the response by saying that the international community has failed the Palestinian people when it couldn't impose after World War II and after the end of the British Mandate, a just and sustainable form of self-determination for both peoples. But from particularly a US perspective, less, I guess, than a Canadian perspective, the US has been such a strong weapons supplier and important source of foreign economic and military assistance over a long period of time, now giving virtually 50% of the total assistance it gives to the entire world, including countries that need help much more than Israel does. There is a particular American answer to that kind of concern, that it represents a feeling that there is a disproportionate and distorting special relationship between the US and Israel that prevents the realization of stability and peace in the region as a whole, and that it's time that Israel lived up to its international law obligations as a way of achieving a better future for the region, for its own people, and certainly for the Palestinian people. So it's all part, I think, of saying that as long as Israel has defied international public opinion, and as long as it's seen as a geopolitical protectorate of the United States, it represents a symbolic intrusion in the post-colonial world of northern power on a people in the global south that has been denied its fundamental rights. And for many people, including for Nelson Mandela and the South African anti-apartheid forces, Israel was the greatest outstanding unresolved moral issue on the global justice agenda. And I think it remains symbolically in that status, even though it's certainly true that there are several national situations that involve much more massive and bloody violations of human rights than what is taking place in Israel-Palestine.
Wonderful. Yeah, I think, how that question relates to Canada as well in terms of the singling out. I guess the Canadian government also singles out Israel in the sense of it being exempt from criticism, whereas other countries are sanctioned and criticized very openly by our government. This government refuses to in any way openly criticize and challenge Israel. So you can really, I think, flip it on its head. I mean, just kind of based on this this question that I just received here, I was wondering if you could speak, if you're in a position to speak at all, on the op-ed that you had placed in the Toronto Star in response to Rosie DiMano's very defamatory piece about you. Are you able to speak at all about that agreement that was reached?
Well, only that the Toronto Star agreed to publish my response, and I chose not to give the kind of credibility to her column that would result by trying to defend myself against the specific allegations, all of which were taken out of context and were really of no general interest. I've never been a 9/11 conspiracy theorist, and have only said on a couple of occasions that there's some unanswered questions about the 9/11 attacks that the American people deserve answers about. And that's far from a conspiracy view. It just says the official version needs to be clarified and made more convincing. Her column completely reproduced the NGO UN Watch's annual attack on me over the 6 years. Those were the same talking points that they used each time. There was nothing new in her column, really.
Thank you for that. So this is a question here around the kind of difference in treatment of apartheid in Israel-Palestine with the apartheid regime in South Africa. Why was the South African apartheid regime universally despised, whereas Israel, for the most part, is still able to get by with what it's doing?
Yes, that's an interesting question, sort of the reverse of the question of why is Israel bashing so prominent and prevalent. I think there are a number of reasons for that. One of them is the sense that's quite widespread that the Jewish people have been victims of persecution themselves, and that Israel was created in the aftermath and under the dark shadows cast by the Holocaust. So I think that's one part of that explanation. Another is that Israel has been much more diplomatically ingenious in its efforts to make itself useful to other countries. Jeff Halper has written rather extensively on the success of Israel's arms diplomacy and the police and counterinsurgency capabilities of over 100 countries in the world. They may be supportive of the criticisms of Israel, but they won't go too far diplomatically because their own interests are engaged. And finally, I think the geopolitical protection that the US and to some extent Canada and Europe provide Israel is something that South Africa never enjoyed, even from such strategic allies as Britain and the US that always were sensitive to the concerns of their African and African American minorities. And so you never had the willingness to really defend South African apartheid, even from such conservative leaders as Margaret Thatcher and Ronald Reagan. Domestic politics in both those cases forced the British and American governments to impose sanctions on South Africa toward the end of the apartheid regime. So there are significant differences, and I would put this different connection to geopolitics as probably the central and most important explanation of the difference.
Thank you, Richard. That's another question here. What do you see as forces and avenues for a just resolution of the conflict that we should pay attention to and support?
I think at this stage, we have to accept the idea that nothing feasible that produces a sustainable peace is on the political horizon. And for that reason, there's both a responsibility and opportunity for civil society groups such as your own to create a political climate in which diplomacy can again occur, but this time on the basis of balance and on the premise of the equality of the two peoples, and with a direct commitment to the attainment of a sustainable peace premised on the realization of human rights. It should be remembered that one of the features of the Oslo failed diplomacy was the insistence that international law was irrelevant, not that it was complied with or not, but that it was irrelevant, and that Palestinian grievances based on international law should be deferred until what were called the final status negotiations, which never came about. So Israel was successful in expanding the settlements, even though even the US government regarded them as violations of the Geneva Convention, Article 49, Paragraph 6, and Israel was the beneficiary of these failed Oslo negotiations because it continued to de facto annex important parts of the West Bank. It built the separation wall deep in Palestinian territory, and the Palestinians suffered a diminished set of prospects in a curtailed territory. So people who say the failure of Oslo was a setback for both sides misunderstand the reality. The reality is that it was a significant political victory for Israel, as it gave it time to pursue a maximal Zionist vision, and it was a severe setback for the Palestinians because they couldn't effectively contest the loss of the 22%, the loss of the remnant, territorial remnant that they had after the armistice in 48, or in 60, and after the outcome of the 67 war.
Can you elaborate a bit, Richard, on your thoughts regarding the Palestinian Authority? I mean, they were the overseeing body representing the Palestinians and dealing with Oslo, and I mean, we know what your thoughts are on that. But I guess at this point, how should we perceive the Palestinian Authority? What role do they play?
Well, I think that the Palestinian Authority continues to be the sole internationally recognized body that can represent the Palestinian people. It's extremely controversial among Palestinians, both living under exile, in exile, and living under occupation and in exile. They feel that Abbas is a compromised leader, that the Palestinian Authority collaborates with Israel in maintaining security. Actually, another defect of Oslo was that, in effect, it subcontracted control over the Palestinian people to the Palestinian Authority, as well as fragmenting that remnant of historic Palestine that was under occupation into these area A, B, and C. So that there is this sense also that the Palestinian Authority is dependent on external.
Looks like it's frozen there. Richard, can you hear me?
Oh, yes, they say my internet unstable. Yes, I can hear you. Can you hear me?
Yeah, you're back on now.
Yes, I got a message that the internet connection was unstable. Maybe I was saying things that were destabilized. Who knows? But the main point, I think, is the recognition that as long as the Palestinian people are divided and those Palestinians living in Gaza are unrepresented because Hamas is treated as a terrorist group, and the efforts at unification between Hamas and the Palestinian Authority have proved to be very short-lived and unstable. And we should take note, I think, of this recent Hamas document that moves away from its earlier absolutism and real anti-Semitism toward a view that I've encountered in my contact with the Hamas leaders during the period that I was Special Rapporteur, which is that they want a period of prolonged peaceful coexistence, and that they have tried a number of ways, including by private secret diplomacy with the George W. Bush administration as soon as they were elected in Gaza, to say that unless some kind of coexistence can be worked out based on withdrawal from the occupation, the end of the blockade, there will be terrible violence between the two sides. And I think that from their own point of view, Hamas has chosen to pursue its goals by political means, not by armed struggle. At the same time, it reserves the right to defend the Palestinian people and has very little capacity to do that, though its indiscriminate rockets are violations of international law, and they're given an exaggerated prominence. And if you look at the casualty ratios, Israelis have suffered, but incomparably less than what the Palestinians have endured through this period since 2007, when Hamas took over the governmental administration of Gaza.
Thanks, Richard. I think we have time for maybe one or two more questions. I'm just sifting through here. I'm going to do my best to try and make sense of this question, and I guess I'll ask you to, Richard, interpret it how best you can. I'm not sure I understand the intention of the questioner. So can you please help us to respond better to the point that we can't talk about Palestinian peoples without including Jewish people, and in brackets, especially in university classrooms?
Well, I'm not sure myself exactly what that means. I think there is this effort by Zionist and strongly pro-Israeli groups to complain about academic initiatives, courses, and lectures, conferences that they perceive to be unbalanced in some way, and therefore the insistence that if there is a Palestinian speaker or Palestinian course, then it should also present Zionist or Israeli points of view. Now, this was never the case for the earlier period in which pro-Israeli and pro-Zionist views dominated the academy. You never heard this complaint either from Palestinians and certainly not from Israeli groups or from the government of Israel. So it does reflect, in a way, the changing political climate that is more critical of Israel, including among Jews, but it also reflects the growing nervousness of Israel about what they call the delegitimation project, that they regard as a greater threat to Israeli security than armed struggle at this stage. The Right Institute, which is one of the leading think tanks in Israel, has been arguing for some time that Israel is really confronted by this growing effort to delegitimize its policies and practices. In fact, they argue that it's an attempt to delegitimize the state of Israel itself. And that's the other side of what I've been claiming is the legitimacy war that is being properly and intelligently waged by those that are seeking the fulfillment of Palestinian rights that have been too long deferred.
Thanks very much for that, Richard. Somebody is wondering here if the PLO still exists, and if so, what's the relationship to the Palestinian Authority, if any?
That's a shadowy question. I mean, or the answer has to be shadowy because Abbas is the president of the Palestinian Authority and the chairman of the PLO. And they are basically both under his control and seem not to create, and there's no friction that's at least discernible between the two. So it's hard to know what the role of the PLO is at this time, although it claims to have the interests of the Palestinian people at its core, rather than just the interests of those living under occupation. The Palestinian Authority technically is the administration of the territory that is still under, from an international law point of view, under Israeli occupation. So in that sense, it's the delegated governmental authority that collaborates with Israel, especially with respect to security. The PLO is a more of an umbrella organization with more wider spectrum of representation, and its membership is more concerned with the refugee issue, the right of return, the conception of the Palestinian struggle as one of the struggle of a people rather than a struggle to regain territory.
Very interesting. Thanks, Richard. I'm going to ask you one final question here, because I think it's a bit different from some of the others that I see here, addressing the issue of the right to self-determination. So the questioner asked, doesn't the right to self-determination imply some degree of ethnic-based decision-making, and from there, in a sense, an ethnocracy?
Well, that's an interesting question about which I should probably have the opportunity to think more fully about before giving an answer off the top of my head. The right of self-determination does pertain to peoples, not to governments and not to states. And it's the right to form a political solution that protects the other rights of of a separate people. The right of self-determination is set forth in Article 1 of the both covenants, the Covenant on Civil and Political Rights and the Covenant on Economic, Social, and Cultural Rights. And it is forward as a right that encompasses all the other rights, that it is the foundational right, the seminal right of in contemporary international human rights law. And so I think what the best way to answer that kind of question is to say that the right of self-determination includes the right to establish a state, but it doesn't include the right to establish an ethnic state, because then it runs into the constraints imposed by international law, which is to treat all peoples living within a given territory on the basis of equality, regardless of religion, ethnicity, and the rest. So that to the extent Jews are a people, they have a right of self-determination inside historic Palestine. But they don't have a right to infringe on the right of non-Jews living within that state. See, that's an international law question that's subsidiary to the exercise of the right of self-determination. I'm not sure, that's a sort of legalistic answer that doesn't go all the way, but I think it does reach the issue of whether a legitimate state in the 21st century can discriminate in its foundational constitutional identity between a dominant ethnicity and the rest of those living within its under its jurisdiction and sovereign authority. And I'm arguing that legitimacy for a state depends on it not claiming that exclusivity.
Very well done, considering that was just off the top of your head. That was very articulate. Thank you, Richard. I keep on saying last question, but I keep on getting more questions that are really interesting, and I wanted to wrap up for 8:30, which is in 6 minutes. So I'm just going to entertain one more question here, if you don't mind, Richard.
Good.
What's your opinion of BDS?
Well, that's a suitable culminating question, I think.
I thought so.
Let me say that the questions have been very appropriate and have certainly enabled me to talk about issues beyond what we were able to talk about in our opening conversation. So I'm grateful for the questions, including this one. And I think the BDS campaign is, from my point of view, a central battlefield, symbolic battlefield in this ongoing legitimacy war that I've been describing. And I feel that unless the Israeli government and its public opinion recalculate Israel's interests in some way that is more compatible with international law and Palestinian self-determination, no sustainable peace will come. And our work as Jews and others who want to see a just and peaceful solution, not only for Israel-Palestine, but for the region as a whole, have I think, a ongoing responsibility to support BDS and to recognize that these attacks on a nonviolent initiative of this sort represent this effort of Israel not to feel pressure to engage positively with international law and international morality in ways that allow the state of Israel to perpetuate this long ordeal of Palestinian suffering. So that I think BDS is playing a crucial role in mobilizing pressure and public opinion, keeping the focus, activist focus on the wrongdoing of Israel, and especially the relationship to the settlements in the West Bank, but more generally than that. And I think it also reflects a failure by the UN and by the governments of the world and by international diplomacy to come up with a viable and acceptable solution. BDS didn't arrive until many decades after the marginalization of the Palestinian people and the failure of the UN, international diplomacy, and even Palestinian armed struggle to find a sustainable peace. So it is a stage in this long process of seeking an end to the conflict that corresponds with our views of justice and equality. Let me end there, and thank you all for this opportunity to speak with everyone.
I think I speak on behalf of everyone when I say that we are hugely appreciative of your time, of your wisdom, of your commitment to social justice, and just your humility and just so generous and kind with your answers. I hope that we got to answering the large majority of the questions that were sent. I tried my best to really take as wide a range as I could and to try and get everyone's answers for the most part addressed. But yes, I apologize to any questions we weren't able to get to. So thank you very much again, Richard. Thanks to all of you for taking the time to participate and to join us today. I just want to reiterate that these kinds of events, these webinars, like all the activities that we do, they take quite a bit of resources, so we would greatly appreciate if you were to make a donation. I'm not going to do the shared screen again. I have a bit of a bad record on that one, but if you just go to ijvcanada.org, you'll see at the top menu, if you click donate or renew, there's going to be clear instructions there for you to donate. If you have any questions about donating, you can send an email to treasurer@ijvcanada.org. We also encourage you to join IJV if you're not a member. You can become a member using that same top menu to click on join. And if you have questions about the membership or the membership form, please email membership@ijvcanada.org.